Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Genomic Forum 2023. My name is Federica Di Palma, and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer and Vice President of Research and Innovation at GBC. As you have heard from Suzanne, we do have an amazing day ahead of us, packed with very exciting sessions. And so it's a pleasure for me to introduce you the very first session of this Genomic Forum, focusing on healthy approaches, promoting inclusive, knowledge-driven, equitable patient care in research study. So that's exactly what the promise of the Human Genome Project gave us. It's benefit and access to healthcare services for all. It was 2003 when the Human Genome Project was sequenced, and is now 2023. And as we gathered today here for this first session, we do recognize that the challenge the healthcare system faces today is in providing exactly that equal access to high quality care for everyone. And we should be able to do so regardless of the socioeconomic background, the race, the geographical location, or disability. We acknowledge that these disparities in access to healthcare have profound consequences on individuals, families, and communities. And therefore, addressing this disparity, it is our responsibility, but it also requires innovative and responsible solutions that are evidence-based. So throughout this first session today, but in generally throughout the entire forum, we will hear from experts, researchers, practitioners in the field of healthcare and research that are going to share their knowledge, experience, and insight to help us understand better how we can overcome this barrier to healthcare access. And possibly we're going to hear about proposed sustainable solutions to overcome them. We'll explore also the role of technology, and which is incredible, and it's expanding at a great pace. And what we do know is that the importance of addressing this question of access to healthcare, equitable access to healthcare, is an important cross-sector collaboration. It is the only way to move forward towards health equity. Therefore, today with this forum, we aim to create a platform for meaningful dialogue, exchange of ideas, and maybe even the development of some actionable strategy. But as we embark on this journey together, we have to remember that health and well-being are a responsibility of the entire society, and this responsibility is shared among all of us today here at this Genomic Forum, and also all of you in the audience. So it is my absolute pleasure to start off this session introducing you today's speaker. And so today's speaker, we don't have the speaker? Oh dear. That's a shame. Keolu was going to be a fantastic speaker. So what I am hoping is actually that we will have the speaker, but maybe we will have the speaker a little bit in a little bit once the technical issues perhaps resolve. So I am still going to give the introduction for Keolu, and then I'm going to swiftly move to our panelists for our panel discussions. So our speaker today, hopefully he can still make it, is an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego, affiliated with the Department of Anthropology, the Global Health Program, and the Ali Choglu Data Science Institute, the Climate Action Lab, and the Indigenous Lab. Dr. Fox is a multidisciplinary research scholar whose interests include genome sequencing, genome engineering, computational biology, evolutionary genetics, paleogenetics, and indigenizing biomedical research. Dr. Fox has published numerous articles on human genetics, biomedicine, ancient genomics, and indigenous data sovereignty. Many of these articles are very recent, and they've been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, and the Proceeding of the Royal Society of Biology, and I encourage you to go find these articles and read them. So I am really hoping that we can hear from Dr. Fox, and in the meantime, we also have an extraordinary panel of experts today to help us with our discussions. But before we move to the panelists, I do also want to remind you that you can ask questions anytime throughout the talk, throughout the conversation, using the Q&A panel on the side of your screen. You can also upvote questions as they appear, and you can choose which ones are the most popular questions during the question and answer session. So thank you very much. And let me move now to the introduction of our panel. Do we have okay, perfect. So we have an extraordinary group of panelists with us today. And what I really love is for the conversation I've just introduced, we have really that multi-sectoral collaboration right here around this table this morning. And so to give it justice, I would like each panelist to introduce themselves and to tell you directly what it is that they bring to the table today for our conversations on healthy approaches to equitable healthcare. So I'll start off in no particular order as they are shown on my screen with Dr. Sean Hercules. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Federica. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Sean Hercules, and I completed a PhD at McMaster University in cancer biology and epidemiology. And for my PhD, I did work with women of African ancestry across Nigeria, Barbados, and Jamaica with triple negative breast cancer. So in my work, I worked with these populations, I worked with these biospecimens and all the physicians, the clinical team, etc. So I do bring that those experiences to this panel discussion. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Princess Margaret Cancer Centre in Toronto, where I am doing work on high-risk high-risk breast cancer populations across Toronto. So I'm essentially looking for early molecular changes that happens within the normal breast of populations at risk for breast cancer that do lead to cancer, in the hopes that we can stop breast cancer. It's a very lofty goal, but that's my work currently. Yeah, and I'm also at a conference, so that explains my backdrop. It's not my bedroom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Linda Riches.
Good morning. My name's Linda Riches. I'm a patient partner researcher with the pharmacogenomic testing for major depression project. I'm also a semi-retired high school performing arts teacher. In addition to volunteering as a patient partner, I volunteer for restorative justice and I teach mindfulness to youth and adults. My recent involvement with the PGX for Depression project since 2020 allowed a deep dive into genetics, health economic modeling, and the opportunity to become a patient researcher. In addition, it led to the publication of the article called Co-Learning Commentary, a patient partner perspective in mental health care research, with my writing partners, Lisa Ridgway and Louisa Edwards. I believe in the value of people with lived experience becoming agents of change in all aspects of transforming healthcare. I look forward to the day when all healthcare practitioners and researchers are in concordance with that belief. While each of us is a patient, patient partners and caregivers have a different perspective from researchers. As we can attest, working with patient partners from the beginning of a research project in a meaningful way and not as ticking a box can have positive outcomes for all involved, and I encourage people to do this always. Genetics research can save money, it can decrease stress on patients and caregivers, and it can replace despair with hope. I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Jeannie Landry.
Thanks, Federica. My name is Ginny Landry. I'm calling from South Vancouver, unceded Musqueam territory, and I'm a Métis Nation of British Columbia citizen with family from St. Albert and Lestock. I am a patient partner on the same project as Linda mentioned previously on pharmacogenomic testing for major depression. It's been my first experience as a patient partner. I've been working with the program since 2020, and it's been very pleasantly surprising. I came into it thinking that, again, like Linda said, it might be just box ticking, but I've been able to participate really thoroughly in quite large scale stuff like economic modeling. And it's been really, really impressive to see how valuable patient partner um, input has been to the project.
And Miley, Twiley, thank you.
Aloha, everyone. Maile Tawali'i. I'm calling in from Hawaii. I am a collaborative investigator at Kaiser Permanente. I work for the Hawaii Permanente Medical Group. It's just a pleasure to be with you folks here today. My background academically is in health services with an emphasis in public health genetics and public health informatics. But I've had a lot of opportunity to work with a number of review boards, biorepositories, indigenous communities around the world. The focus of the work with them is to ensure the protection of indigenous material in biorepositories. Some of my favorite work that I've been able to do has been actually with you folks in Canada. I sit as the chair for the International Indigenous Advisory Council for the Silent Genomes Project. I work with Dr. Laura Arbour and Nadine Caron and do amazing work to ensure that there is some genetic, maybe diagnostic abilities, as well as research that supports the needs of the Indigenous populations in Canada. So it's a real joy to be with you folks today, and I hope that I can help in this conversation. Aloha.
Thank you very much, everyone. This is fantastic. We have an amazing group of people here, so I'm going to start it off. And the first question that I would like to ask you from your own, perspective is, how can we ensure that research studies prioritize the needs and perspective of underrepresented patient populations? To ensure this end point of equitable and inclusive patient care for all. And with that, we have a couple of today with us, we have some patients participating in some of these studies. So I would like to also sort of tag along a question, which is, how can we encourage more active participation? Are there any barriers on active participation and engagements from this community or any community in this research study, so that we can ensure that the results are truly representative of diverse patients' populations? So those are my two questions. And I'd like to start with Sean, your perspective as a researcher embedded in this type of studies.
Yeah, yes. Thank you, Federica. What I find interesting was that our two patient perspectives panelists mentioned that for a lot of studies, it's kind of like a tick on the box. And I think that's the pitfall of many researchers. Researchers are just like, okay, well, we need to have these populations. Let's just make it happen. Let's just add these people type of thing. And that is the completely wrong approach. So for my PhD, along with my supervisor, Dr. Juliet Daniel, we formed relationships with these communities that we did our research in. And we were actually told that, they were approached by many people across the US and Canada that wanted to do research among these populations. And they were like, no, like we don't trust you. We don't know who you are. Like you're just trying to exploit us, exploit our tissues or our clinical work. Like they just felt like it was exploitative. However, with us, like there was a level of trust that was built with us and the pathologists and the patients. So that is very important. Like you should actually do it out of because you genuinely care and not because you're trying to just do research on these populations. I'm actually at a conference right now, and at this conference, they're talking about increasing African ancestry and other ancestry genomes outside of the European ancestry genomes within their work. And it's really strange to hear just kind of how frequently some people talk about these things. And yeah, it's a real problem. I think a huge barrier is that uh, for some researchers that don't have those lived experiences, they don't think with that lens. So perhaps that's what's causing the whole checkbox type of approach for many researchers. So I do think it's important for them to actually foster genuine relationships with their colleagues with different lived experiences, so that they have that perspective and actually care about the populations that they're working with.
This is fantastic remarks. I mean, I took some notes, trust, and not making it look like an exercise that we are ticking a box. You're absolutely right, Sean. There is a narrative now, particularly amongst the genomic researchers, because of course we do know that the majority of genomic studies are representing population of European ancestry. And now, if you know, I think about over 90% of the genomic studies have European participations, when we actually know that Europeans only are 16% of the total world population. So we do have a huge gap here to fill. But the narrative is now, you make a very good point. This narrative, we sort of, it's not about just getting more numbers, getting more population. We actually have to understand why we are doing this. And this panel today, this first session, is focusing on the end goal, was that we always had as a promise of the human genome to drive those benefits of healthcare to everybody, so equitably and accessibly. And now we have a huge gap. And what I hear you saying as well, it's another important element, which I think perhaps well, not perhaps, for sure. I mean, we have had inaccessible and insufficient communication, and which have left a lot of our research participants from diverse background unclear about the benefits of their participation, and most importantly, or how their data will be used once the study concluded. So, extremely great point, really. I'm going to move over to Linda. I wondered whether you had anything to contribute to this question.
Thank you. Definitely. I find similarities in what I would like to say as to what we've heard. It's not just that we have a Eurocentric focus in research. We also fail to reach out and connect with people from other marginalized communities. For example, people with disabilities are often missed in research projects. And from rural communities. I live in a semi-rural area, and I would say that this is a huge area that is overlooked. Just in a meeting earlier this week, we were discussing how you find your patients for research projects, because often the look for those patients comes in organizations that I would say are also Eurocentric and are not very innovative in how they search for patient partners. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, I think that when you're looking for partners who may not jump to first mind, is that you need to reach out and perhaps have contacts with whom those people are familiar with, who can share information and consult and have ongoing contact in order for those people to feel better about their involvement. I agree, previous practices of misuse of data, misrepresentation on the purpose of research, those things all factor into patients being leery of involvement in research work. So I guess I would stress that researchers need to be clear. They need to realize that they need to be imaginative in how they contact people, and most important, they need to be respectful during the whole process.
Thank you very much, Linda. Those are very important thoughts. I'm going to move swiftly to also Ginny with her perspective from her point of view and experience.
Thanks, Frederica. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to echo Linda. My first experience as a patient partner started 3 years ago, and I've gotten the impression that my experience has maybe been a lot better than other patient partners have experienced. The project I've been part of has had patient partners involved from the very beginning, which I think is really important. A lot of groups that will have researchers approach them find that researchers come in with wanting answers to questions they have already developed, as opposed to being responsive to what the population is willing to say, and allowing them to formulate the questions that they want to be asked and answered by the research. Having involvement from the very beginning as a patient partner has allowed us to help navigate the research on a larger scale than we would have been able to if we had been approached later in the project. I think there's also hesitancy to involve patient partners in things that are seen as too esoteric or too complicated for them to understand. We pushed really hard to be involved in some of the more complicated economic modeling and other modeling in the project that, I didn't finish university. It's a kind of background that a lot of patient partners are going to have when you're talking about major depression treatment. You lose out on a lot of work and education advancements because of mental illness. But that doesn't mean that I wasn't able to understand what the modeling was or able to contribute to it. And even offering that level of respect of allowing us to help out with it really helped us trust the other team members, regardless of who had what accreditation or not. The other reality is that I am never going to make as much money as I would have if I didn't have mental illness. It's only been possible for me to participate because the patient partners are being remunerated properly. I work a full-time job outside of my patient partner work. That's not uncommon with patient partners. I'm able to be paid enough for the project that I can actually take the time off of work and not lose so much income that I can't participate. And I know there's been a lot of push to do things more in person since COVID has become less of a threat. But the ability to accommodate people who are only able to join digitally is still a big deal. To accommodate people who are rural, disabled, just to have the option of different ways of participating. And I also found that being really responsive to the patient partners' desired input on things like vocabulary, it really made us comfortable actually bringing up things and pushing back on things that we knew were not part of our experience.
Thank you, Ginny, for sharing that with us. And I do know, in fact, that we chatted before your presence to this panel on whether you were able to participate and have the time to be able to take time off from your current job to be able to be on the panel with us. So thank you very much. Maile, it's great that you were able to join us, and over to you for your very unique perspective.
Sure. Thank you so much. I just want to say I love the feedback from folks who are Jeannie and Linda, the patient perspective. I think your viewpoints are very valuable in this work, and I love the fact that you're involved in projects that include patient partners. I think that's fabulous. I think my suggestion for people to consider is a little bit more of a long-term game, sort of thinking down the road of what this should really look like. I think it starts with funders putting out a proposal application, funding application call for funding that include requirements that researchers actually be from communities, and that would encourage folks to focus on the fact that we need people who have lived experience actually leading research studies. As a Native Hawaiian, knowing that the issues of my community, I live and breathe those issues, and therefore when I do research, I have my entire community behind me supporting this work. So I think really showing that demonstrated experience, lived experience in communities that are being focused on are really important for this kind of work. And so looking at universities and programs that are encouraging people from the communities, minority backgrounds, rural areas, indigenous populations that are actually attending universities and getting the degree so that they too can lead these research projects. But not to say that you have to be the same as the community that you're researching. I've worked with some amazing researchers who have not been members of the community, but have lived experience having spent years in service to communities, folks like Laura Arbor, Wiley Burke, folks who have given their lives to serving in these communities. They may not be members of those communities, but they have lived and experienced a lifetime of service in those spaces. So you don't have to be from those communities, but you have to be able to demonstrate that you've served them for years. And I just really appreciate folks who have given their lives to serving in our communities. So I think demonstrated connection to community needs to be a requirement for funders to actually fund those projects. So that's just my addition. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, that's also some very important notes that you have made. I have taken, with my hat of Chief Scientific Officer here at Genome BC, I've taken note of the funders note. You're absolutely right. That's where we can change. And I do know that we are trying, and funding agency globally are really trying to think about this and trying to fill the gap. We're not doing enough and fast enough, but we do have some. The NHGRI, certainly has been leading with trying to diversify their study. We are going to hear from some of these very big studies later on through our session, like the All of Us project in the US, and we know that we have some the Africa H3 big population initiative, also funded by the Wellcome Trust. But nevertheless, I think that there is so much more that we can do to cater to diverse communities that are not reached, as Linda also was pointing out, and that it has to happen not just randomly. It has to happen via the connections that already exist, leveraging, as you say, the experience and both. I think Maile and Sean, both of you have really made this point about there is years and years of experience and this has to obviously leverage on that. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for this. This is great. And do we have Keolu?
Yes,
I heard them.
I'm on here. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear. We can hear you. This is fabulous, Chiolo. I have introduced you because I was certain that we were able to solve the technological issues that you were having. So I am really glad.
We were.
Yes, I'm really glad that you are with us. So we have started a fabulous panel discussion, but I actually think that we shouldn't be prescriptive into our into the way we are doing things. So we started off with a question, and that is a question to the researchers and the patients representative on our panel today on how can we achieve, better equity and better diverse participation of patients' populations in our research study. And we've heard some fantastic perspective from Sean, who, as a researcher from Bailey, and also from two patients, really, Linda and Jeannie here. So, Chiolo, I wanted to give you a chance to also perhaps say something to this, to contribution to this question. And then I wanted to ask permission to my team if then we can go into Chiolo's presentation and come back to the panel after that. So, Chiolo, over to you for your contribution.
Yes, thank you so much. I echo the sentiments of Miley and others in terms of really putting pressure on funders. I recently was thinking about the FDA's new mandate to make clinical trials more diverse in the United States of America and what that means for the development of new therapies in the future. I also, beyond the idea that we need more representation, I think we also need to build our own institutions vertically. It's important to create standards amongst existing institutions, but building our own institutions, our own genome sequencing capacity, our own startups, and serving our communities that way, I think is very much the future.
Indeed. Yes, this is a great point. So if my team allows, we would like to for Chiolo to give its presentation and then return to the panel discussions with Chiolo. Would that be okay? Excellent. I heard a yes. So, and is it okay with you, panelists? I see nodding, so I'm assuming that this is okay. And I think that Chiolo's presentation, which I know is going to be great, will give us also some further thoughts for our discussion. So thank you very much. Chiolo, I did introduce you while you were trying to log in. And so it's a pleasure to have you here, and over to you.
Yes, I'm honored to be here. Thank you guys so much for the opportunity. And it's just a tremendous group of people on this panel and everything that's happening in British Columbia. Can everyone hear me well? I hope so. But as you could see, I've titled this Disrupting the Indigenous DNA Supply Chain. And could I go to the next slide? Currently, I'm at the University of California, San Diego, which is perennially ranked #1 by Surfer magazine. We love that. It's also an interesting place to work and focus on genomics and genomic technology because it's a thriving sort of ecosystem for a lot of companies, like our largest service provider for genome sequencing, Illumina. And there's also a focus beyond just thinking about human health, but other things with respect to climate resilience and thinking about the land and the ocean. Could you go to the next slide? We just started our Indigenous Futures Institute. It's a tremendous opportunity for us to all begin to think about the future. UCSD is a special place for this. We've had a number of different futurists that have received training or contribute to this whole ecosystem, including Octavia Butler, Angela Davis, Craig Venter, and others. So it's going really well. Could you go to the next slide? So well, in fact, that we're hiring 15 people. We have 15 FTEs spanning boundaries from everything from theater to architecture to medicine and climate science. And if you know anyone that's interested, please apply and check out the information and link below. Next slide, please. But I come from a whole community of indigenous futurists. We brought you, as Kanaka Māori Native Hawaiians, we've brought you the first color newspapers on planet Earth. We've brought you universal health care. We've had electricity in Iolani Palace well before the White House. And we are more than prepared to use new and emerging technologies to empower our communities. Next slide, please. And my whole mo'okuauhau, or genealogy, is from the Kohala region on the Big Island, Moku'okeawe. And this is the area where we've been thinking about indigenous futures for some time. Next slide, please. And it's also home to a just wealth of biodiversity. With 11 out of 13 biomes on planet Earth. Also, we have the most diverse soil regiments in the world. And at the same time, it is the extinction capital of the world and the invasive species capital of the world. So it's a really complex place where we're dealing with these dynamic forces like the tourism industrial complex and the military industrial complex. And we are thinking about the impact of many of these different things in one of the most isolated places in the world. Could you go to the next slide? And on top of all of that, biodiversity, it is the most diverse place in America in terms of human beings. And Hawaii County ranks #1 out of the new census data. And Maui County #2, Kauai #4, and then where Maile guys is from, Honolulu County, which is #11. And it's really interesting because if you're interested in creating the next generation of precision medicine therapy, you should be thinking about serving the most diverse communities in our country. If you believe Hawaii is part of America, could you go to the next slide, please? And here you can see that although places like Hawaii are extremely diverse, the vast majority of genome-wide association studies exclusively feature individuals of Western and European ancestry. And this is highly problematic because we are not serving many of the communities that make up the United States of America. But the more concerning statistic there is at the bottom, and you can see that 72% of genetic discoveries have taken places in 3 countries. And that means that a lot of this information is getting outsourced to America, the UK, and Iceland. And that's a really big issue when you think about how much genetic diversity actually exists on this planet and the fact that it's a very valuable resource. Could you go to the next slide, please? It's so valuable, in fact, that there's a whole industry of commodification around this. So if you look at all of these patents on the wall at the Illumina headquarters in La Jolla, California, adorning this wall like moose heads in a hunting lodge, you can see that people are making trillions of dollars off of intellectual property that's related to DNA sequencing and editing. And these results show that 45,000 patents have been filed worldwide that mention DNA sequencing. Could you go to the next slide, please? And when you know that data has surpassed oil as the #1 most valuable commodity on planet Earth, it brings up a new series of questions. Could you go to the next slide, please? And when we start to make parallels with other resources like water and rare earth minerals and timber, you start to realize that we have some serious issues going on with our supply chain. What is going on with the supply chain of DNA? And when we compare and contrast it to many other resources on planet Earth, it should start to resemble a lot of the colonial and imperial relationships that have defined many countries' wealth at this point in time. Could you go to the next slide, please? Let's take cobalt, for example. Cobalt powers the computers that we're using to have this conversation. It is mostly derived from the Democratic Republic of Congo in a place called the Copper Belt, where 75% of the world's cobalt is collected. And here you can see an artisanal mine, and you have some of the highest rates of child labor on planet Earth. I think there's some kind of feedback loop, but okay, it's gone maybe. Now, but my point is, and why I bring this up is, do you think that Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, a $1 trillion company, is in touch with his supply chain? Do you think that he's ever been to the bottom of one of these artisanal mines where this resource is coming from? It seems like this whole industry is out of touch. Could you go to the next slide? And that's why we've created images of Tim Cook visiting the bottom of one of these artisanal mines. And the reason is, and we've used Mid-Journey, which is a AI image generator, to put pressure on individuals like this to actually become in touch with the supply chain, which they're deriving many different resources. Could you go to the next slide, please? And that brings us to why data sovereignty is so important. It's really important that our communities are in charge and in control of our resources, because we don't want to recapitulate other such relationships in broken supply chains, such as cobalt and many other resources that exist. And we don't want that to happen with data. And we certainly don't want that to happen with genome sequence data that is derived from our mo'oku'auhau, or genealogies, that have direct influence in potential commodification. Could you go to the next slide, please? And so when we see large-scale projects like the All of Us program, or what's going on at many different pharmaceutical companies like Regeneron, where they're trying to stack the deck for genetic discovery and sequence the genomes of geographically sequestered communities of people, many of whom are indigenous, you get to see that this is not a fair transaction. This is looking like the development of a whole field where we have unequal access to the potential IP that will be derived from these large-scale sequencing studies that will result in new therapeutics in the future. Could you go to the next slide, please? What we don't want is the development of new drugs that hit the market, like this drug from Vertex, which is a $300,000 drug. This is a huge problem in the United States of America, where a lot of this information, including transactions and collaborations and partnerships with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, has led to the development of a $300,000 drug. And that is a violation of the common rule and many, many other really disturbing, unethical decisions in the space of drug development. Could you go to the next slide, please? We also know that this data is extremely valuable, with 23andMe selling access to their database for $300 million, and GlaxoSmithKline, to GlaxoSmithKline, and the Blackstone Group acquiring Ancestry DNA for $4.7 billion in 2020, showing the value of this information is on the rise. Could you go to the next slide? We also have entry points where individuals want to commodify and create intellectual property around individual genetic mutations that were discovered in Samoa that look like they protect against type 2 diabetes, but predisposed to obesity. And this is just shameful that this happened recently. You can check out that patent claim. Could you go to the next slide? And that should bring up a number of ideas around the future of data governance for indigenous communities. When we think about genomics and genomic data and data science from the point of view or vantage point of indigenous futurism, what does that look like? Could you go to the next slide, please? It looks like vertical integration. Sometimes we end up focusing on horizontal standard building between institutions, and sometimes we need to build our own institutions, startups, and capacity to store, hold, and protect and safeguard our data. And that is exactly what Henry Ford did when he started to create and develop the Model T by buying swaths of land in the Amazon. And from one Amazon to the other, this is exactly what Amazon Web Services is doing, positioning itself as one of the largest companies in the world based on the storage of your data. Next slide, please. And that's why we started the Native Biodata Consortium. This is research for natives, by natives, indigenous people, from the founders of our organization to the creation of the United States' first genome sequencing center and biorepository on reservation land. We are creating and building capacity vertically. Next slide, please. We are thinking about building technological systems to create transparency and accountability in this space. And that has to do with the way that we are using digital infrastructure to really facilitate and build an inventory tracking system for our biobank. Next slide, please. We're also thinking about really creative ways to share really precious information using things like federated learning approaches to take statistical models that apply to data itself, but protect the really valuable parts of the data that communities deem should not be shared. Next slide, please. We're also thinking about data trusts models as rapid collaborative opportunities for partnerships and collaborations. Next slide, please. We're thinking about approaches to equitable benefit sharing, like this piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, holding the NIH and All of Us program to task, saying, if you're going to sequence 1 million people's genomes in the United States of America, then you should be sharing proceeds of that revenue and intellectual property with the individuals that allowed you to sequence that in the first place. After all, the All of Us program is funded by federal taxpayers' money. That is our money. Next slide, please. And these ideas around benefit sharing and approaches to equitable benefit sharing are ancient. They are really brilliant forms of mutual aid that indigenous people have been practicing for millennia. And this is exactly what we do in Hawaii. If we're fishing and we catch 10 fish, we're delivering pieces of fish to people who need them in our community before we stock them in our own freezers. Next slide. And this idea of benefit sharing is why we started Variant Bio. This is a genome sequencing company that is really focused on benefit sharing and making sure that percentage of proceeds in the development of any downstream therapeutics go to the communities that enabled that and made that possible. And you can check more out about that in the future. Next slide, please. And we're also announcing and have announced Variant Bio's Affordable Medicines Pledge. And that is, we don't just give 4% of the proceeds for the IP and the revenue that we get from the development of therapies. We also provide free access to those drugs to communities that enabled it. And next slide, please. And with that, I'll just leave it at this. There's no substitute for grassroots research and democratizing technology. We also always have to work hand in hand with our community members, and none of this would be possible without them. And thank you so much for the opportunity, and I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Keolu. Thank you very much. This was, a very a fantastic presentation with some amazing messages. And thank you for delivering those. I think they actually landed very strongly, I am sure. So let's go back into our panel discussion then straight after this wonderful presentation. And I just once more, I want to remind people that you are welcome to write questions using the Q&A function on the side. And so if you have any question regarding Keolu's talk or in general for any of the panelists, please do put in the question, and we will reserve time for Q&A with all of our members here. Okay, so this was really interesting, and Keolu and I have known each other, and we have been working together on some on this aspect of benefit sharing. This is something that actually, in my own personal work as well as a researcher, I have dedicated a substantial amount of time thinking and reflecting about it. And I wanted to then pose a question, given before we go back into our discussion, given this presentation by Keolu, is I would like to ask Linda and Jeannie, and then I also any contribution from the other two panelists. How would you feel about participating in research studies if they included a benefit sharing agreement? I mean, where you potentially would share the benefit, whether that be any, it might not be financial, it could be also non-financial if the study did lead to the development of successful therapeutics. Would this be an important factor for you deciding to participate? I mean, we've heard a little bit from Jeannie with regard to how important it was for her to be remunerated for her participation, but in the studies in the first place. But in general, how would you feel about the benefit sharing? Linda?
I think that benefits should benefit all, not just people in the study. So I really feel that whatever is gained should then be shared back to the whole community. I agree with Ginny in terms of remuneration. It helps people like ourselves who are involved as patient partner researchers for a longitudinal study where we were not test subjects, but we were contributing to the overall project. But I really believe that the benefits need to go back to the entire community. I don't believe in it just being for the people in the study. So the project we're involved in is on genetic testing involving major depression. And my goal in being involved in that is so that the results of that project and future projects benefit all people who are suffering from major depression, regardless of your ancestry, regardless of where you live, regardless of your economic status. Everyone should benefit.
Absolutely. And I think that was indeed there is the intention. It's not to benefit one individual, but to benefit community. Jeannie, what's your take on this?
For sure. Thank you, Frederica. Part of the reason that I decided to pursue this particular patient partner project is I've participated in medical studies before for things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, mindfulness therapy, things like that, where you have study subjects who are either benefiting or not benefiting during the study, and my pursuit of those was kind of out of spite. I knew there were things that I was never going to be able to afford on my own. If I wanted to access them as treatments, I had to do it as a medical subject, with the knowledge that even if the results showed that these were really, really beneficial things, there was not necessarily any chance that they would get covered more by private insurance companies, much less provincial coverage for something that's actually accessible to everybody. A big part of the appeal of this particular patient partner project was that you didn't necessarily have had to have pharmacogenomic testing performed on you before participating, and getting the testing yourself wasn't part of us participating as patient partners. It was entirely seeing what had worked in previous studies and whether it was feasible to implement it province-wide, not just something that, if you're lucky enough to have an employer that has Green Shield that will pay the extra for the testing, cool, would it work for you? Literally something that is accessible to everybody. And I say spite. I know it's kind of a negative thing, but it's also kind of a righteous indignation at seeing other people like myself, people who are Indigenous or queer, and seeing how much less access they have to just treatment, not even necessarily good treatment or even dignified treatment, just even the opportunity to hear about it from their doctor is less because of where they live and how much time they get to spend with their doctor and whether they even have access to their doctor. Even if the treatment is something that is not something that they're never going to be able to afford, it's just the concept isn't accessible, and that's unacceptable to me on a big scale. And it's also coming from when we talk about harm that has happened to Indigenous people from genetic testing, it's not this kind of existential fear of where my data is going to be stored or something. It's it genuinely has to do with my legal status in the eyes of the government, can be affected by what is done with Indigenous genetics. So just as part of my ability to exist as a Métis woman in Canada, I want to know and I want to have some say in how my genetics are potentially going to be used.
Frederica, could
Yes.
I just add one thing to that?
Absolutely. And I was going to say, if any of you feels the need to contribute, please let me know. It's supposed to be a conversation. Go, Linda.
So, in terms of equity resulting from research, I do I'm compelled to talk about the fact that there's a huge population, not just in this province, but across the country, our country for sure, that do not receive proper care because of their situations. Not that they're not attached to a GP, but they live beyond that system. And specifically people who are living on the street, who do not have access to, who I would say generally do not have access to any kind of mental health or physical health care. And there is a reluctance on the part of the medical community to reach out to those people unless they are being paid, unless there is something in it for them. And I think that becomes part of the equity balance here, is that we tend to forget about the people that are beyond our sight sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Sean, Miley, anything to add on this?
I'd love to just kind of play devil's advocate, and which I always find to be a really funny expression. But anyway, the idea of coercion and the idea of the way that benefit has been set up in the human subjects process. We know as researchers, we're trained to know that we can't coerce patients into participating. They have to be told specifically there is absolutely no way you will personally benefit from this research, that your participation is based on your willingness to participate without thinking that you'll get any benefit. And so I think this idea of of promising benefit when science really, it's a long road to develop something, and there's no guarantee that there will be a positive outcome that will turn into therapeutic benefit. That I feel that we run the risk of putting or setting up our communities for the participation for benefit without a promise of benefit. And just, I think if we think clearly about how this will work, we really have to rethink the whole human subjects and protections process if we're going to guarantee benefit to communities for participation. We in the research community have to be very careful about what we do to compensate our patients or participants in our research studies. We have to let them know we're not compensating them for like gifting them. We're benefiting them based on their time and the burden that the study puts on them. And so it has to be done in a way that we aren't putting a vulnerable population more at risk by presenting promise of benefit. So I think this work around genomics really has required, it hasn't received, but it requires us to revisit the ethics around it, and the ethics have not caught up with the science yet. And I think we need to really think about the fact that biorepository work is not informed consent, but you are being informed to not be informed, how your tissue will be used. And these types of things, I think, really push up against our current existing ethics structures. And I think we need to, as a group, as a scientific group and community group, sit down and revisit what it means to truly protect human subjects.
Thank you. I think that this is not playing devil's advocate. It's a fact, really, that the ethics have not caught up with the science. We have a huge gap, and we have, you're absolutely right. I don't know if Keolu, would you like to say something to this effect with regard to this comment, and maybe Sean as well?
Yeah. I think many of these ideas and their applications are emerging. We know that benefit sharing has worked in diamond mining, for example, in Botswana. It's been transformative. We know that we can apply it in certain ways. I think one thing that is very hopeful is the idea that we could accumulate the financial resources as a community to buy back land that shaped our genomes and the genomes of our ancestors in the first place. And that to me is very hopeful, because currently in a place like Hawaii, only 1% of our community owns land. And the idea of land ownership and the disenfranchisement of our people and our health and our education systems and the revitalization of our language, all of that is predicated on our connection to land and biodiversity and the way we describe it. And so for me, that is one of the ultimate goals that we should be shooting for.
Sean.
Yeah, it's interesting that I was also thinking about that, the current consent process. Like, you can't really guarantee benefit. Like, the language is just it's different, and yeah, ethics hasn't caught up with where we should be going in order to push these values forward, essentially. So yeah, I'm more thinking about what everyone has said. I don't have anything much to add.
Thank you, Sean. So then I have a couple of questions then as a follow-up from what we've been discussing. And these are questions that I like to ask to Linda and to Jeannie, but please, Keolu and Sean and Miley, do contribute if there is anything that resonates with you in their answers. I'd like to ask specifically the patient's perspective here and ask Linda and Jeannie to speak then to their own experiences. So how how were you influenced in your willingness and ability to participate in a research study from your own point of view? Linda.
Well, the pharmacogenomics project was my second research project that I was involved with as a patient partner researcher. And the first one I was involved with was the research lead was very clear with us right off the bat and established dialogue with us, with all of us, in terms of what they wanted to do and what we were looking for. And I think that was very important. And it encouraged me to stay involved with that project for some time because the trust was built right from the beginning. So I was set up, I would say I was well set up when this second project, the pharmacogenomics project, came along. And as Ginny has mentioned, and we talk about in our paper that we wrote, is that trust was developed right from the beginning with our conversations with our project manager. What she wanted to know what our experience was in the past. She engaged us in dialogue so that there was a trust building process that went on through the entire project. And we were encouraged to speak up. We were encouraged to think of ourselves and the rest of the team as equals, so that we felt that we could speak freely, that we could raise points that hadn't been thought of, perhaps by the research team. I think there was never a time where I felt that I wasn't respected. And yeah, I'll just leave it there so Ginny can have, because she'll have her own stuff that she wants to add.
Thank you. This is great news.
Thank you,
Ginny.
Linda. Thank you, Linda. I guess I'm personally running into the differences between what a lot of, I think, has been talked about is studies where there is actual individual data being generated versus projects like the one that Linda and I have been involved in, where there aren't subjects. There's feedback and discussions that the patient partners are part of that has a bit of a different yield. Coming into the project, it was explicit to me that the goal wasn't to show, pharmacogenomics for major depression is worthwhile for MSP, for the BC government to invest in as a public service. It wasn't coming in with that end goal, but like the question of it, like it could come out that this isn't, or at least at this time, it's not feasible to implement, not just for financial reasons, but because there are other questions about it of implementation that just aren't feasible right now, which even saying no, I think would be beneficial because it has been investigated and because we now have a team of researchers in this field who have been elbow deep with the patient partners for a lot of this. I think in the end, like, I'm just one patient out of however many people in BC that have recurrent major depression. It's been personally beneficial to me to be involved in these discussions, which is, I'm probably not going to go on to do a lot more research like this, but for the people who are the researchers, I would like to think it's been impactful for them to have patient partners be involved in quite high level modeling stuff, things that they don't usually see lay people involved in, and to see what we ended up agreeing was an incredible benefit to that. So I just want to say that it's also beneficial to researchers to have to engage with people who are their subjects of study. It doesn't work to try to find demographics that suit the technologies or medications that you've come up with. You're not trying to sell them something that you've worked on. You're trying to find something that works for them. They're the ones that are existing as the question, as the not necessarily a problem to be solved, but the solutions need to come from what meets their needs and not finding the right patients that have the needs that suit what you've come up with, if that makes sense.
I'll just want to tag team with you, Jenny, on this one. I think the fact that this particular project, the team did not go in with the attitude that pharmacogenomics works for everybody. It was, does it work? Is it affordable? Was how is it an affordable option for people? And I think in terms of my involvement in future research, I'm really interested in how people approach, how doctors and clinicians approach patients with the idea of pharmacogenetics. It's like they need to be clear that this is perhaps not the holy grail. I think I want to say is that it may give some answers, but we know that our DNA can change over a lifetime, that it does not stay necessarily the same as it was when we were born. And there's almost a false promise from some people who are involved in this as a business that you get your genetic testing and then you have the answer for everything else in your life. I don't agree with that. I'm concerned about the fact that it is being held out as an answer for everything, because we don't have the genetic counselors, we don't have the facilities to turn around and offer full-scale genetic testing for everybody. And why would we need that is the question I have that I'm going to lay out there.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Ginny. So I want to go to Sean and Miley then, and maybe pick up from some of the things you have heard here. So it seems to me, I mean, we do have a theme recurring here of obviously clear communication, a theme of understanding, of being clear from the beginning with the goals, of trust building. So from your perspective and as researchers, what are your thoughts on this, and what are you also doing every day in your own research and professional life to ensure that the disengagement moves in the right direction? Sean, you could start.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was letting Miley go first.
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
So,
yeah.
It's fine. So this discussion is reminding me a lot of my PhD work, of course. And one of the things that stood out to me was that after speaking with the pathologist in Nigeria, they were noting that essentially, if you wanted to get your IHC done, so if you wanted to get molecular tests done at this particular hospital, I should say, they had to buy the cassette for the specimen, like the FFPE cassette. They had to buy that. They had to buy the wax as well. they had to buy everything, the formalin, the fixation, everything for the specimen. The patient has to do this. And then the actual sample is sent somewhere else to be assessed, and they don't get the results for another 6 months or something. And without this context, I feel like many researchers would go to some resource-limited settings and be like, okay, like let's do all this genomics work, find out, find out to do the IC, do all of this genomics work to find out how to treat these tumors. But some of these places are limited in capacity for even something like fridges to store the antibodies. So I think just, of course, the reoccurring theme about working with the community to actually find out what they need so that they can actually facilitate better healthcare. So what we actually did in our group was that we partnered with another organization that was able to provide this particular hospital with training. So they flew the pathologist to the US, they got training, they gave them the appropriate like technology that they needed to actually do these assessments in-house. And I think that these types of partnerships are like, that's where you should start. You shouldn't be going into some of these spaces and just like bringing your own agenda and trying to set up something that is not going to work or is not sustainable. I can't remember your question. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's something that I actually crossed my mind hearing Linda and Jenny talk about their experiences.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what was your question? Sorry.
No, you did perfectly good. My question was more about, what are your thoughts, or what have you particularly done in your professional life to ensure that this type of things are addressed, so engagement is done properly, and just Maile.
Sure. The only thing I just to tag on, hearing what folks are saying, I think we need to, as researchers, we need to start to recognize that the research process can be as beneficial, even without actual, maybe a medical solution, but letting people be part of the process to feel like the things that folks are suffering from and are challenged with, that there are people working on it and they're working hard to try to figure out solution. I think that it's an important thing for us as researchers to keep in mind that that research participants are not just human subjects, but they can be invested partners, like Jeannie and Linda talking about just feeling like they're part of the process. They are part of the process in multiple ways. And I think we in the research community, through our education so that we are trained to think this way, through our funding mechanisms that encourage and require peer and patient populations to be involved in the research process, that we think about the fact that maybe benefit isn't a medical solution always, because it takes a long time to get there, but that engaging with community, and not just 2 or 3 individuals, but communities, can be a really helpful process to start the road of recovery for illness, and to just feel like there's a solution at the end of the road. So I just feel like we need to, again, like ethics, rethink what benefit can be, and what it means to engage and to bring the community into the process. And I think I honestly feel like it requires researchers also to be part of the community, and that separation of ivory tower needs to really crumble down so that we can genuinely see research come from community and community-led.
I mean, this is a fantastic point, Maile, that it's something that has been on my mind that I wanted to address with a question to you, and you've done it now. And I think this is perfect. And it's also kind of represented here on our panel. Diversity in the first place needs to be also in the research. not just in the participation of patients in the research studies, but the people leading the research. And that's where possibly we are also going to increase participations of diverse patients through that trust building, that understanding. So I think this is really you're absolutely right. And I go back, and I know that Kyolo is disappeared now, but we knew about this. He's going to come back in a minute. But I going back to his talk and about what they're trying to do in the future indigenous lab, I think it's important and his concept of growing vertically, if I understood correctly what he meant, is just build capacity within the community. This is something that I have also taught personally for a while, and I think a funding agency and just in generally our researcher really need to help build the capacity. So the concept perhaps of benefit sharing, I want to go back to it a little bit, because it would be doing the concept a disfavor if we only associated this benefit sharing concept with individual financial reward, which is not really the concept, but the concept is about what during that process, as Maile described it, what can be given back to a community, what can be built to position that community for the future. And for me, that is capacity building, what so far we have called the capacity building. That should be more also could be part of a research funding mechanism or a criteria or an eligibility for obtaining the research funding in the first place, so that yes, we get the participations, we get the samples, we get the results in the end, but we also build capacity at the same time, because we do want to see a legacy and sustainability for the future. We don't want to perpetrate a colonial mechanism of I take and I don't give back. So this is very interesting where this is going. I wondered anyone we have lots of questions coming up as well on our Q&As, but did anyone want to comment? I see, Linda, you've been nodding a lot. Is it?
I think it's my background in education and my personal beliefs I've built over my lifetime is that we will all get a lot further when we can. To me, when we talk about capacity building, it's building shared understanding and the ability to agree that we don't agree with everything, and yet we can still move forward as a community. So I think there's not enough conversation. It is more about, information coming down from the top. Because if I go out into the area where I live and try to have a conversation about genetics, that conversation will go nowhere where I currently live. And it's not because these people aren't educated, it's not part of their worldly daily experience. However, if we talk about what it is we have in common and what it is we want for our children and the children to come as a place and as a community, what do we see for them? What will they need for their future? I think that's very, very important. And so I think even a presentation like today with all the people that are still to come to speak is we need to build conversations and understanding.
I think the only thing I might add to tag on is about accountability of the researcher. I know for me, as a Native Hawaiian who lives and raises my 6 children in my community, I'm a member of the hula halau that I dance with. I'm the president of the school board. The accountability is, if I were to ever do anything wrong in research, I couldn't live in my community anymore. And that's that's when I talk about the idea of having researchers be genuine members of the community, because we have a lot at stake when we are part of the community. That if something were to go wrong or things were to not be handled in a way that was resonated with the community, they would let me know and I wouldn't be allowed to be part of this community. So I have more skin in the game, I would say, in the sense that I have more to lose than someone who isn't part of the community as a researcher. So when I ask people about the informed consent process and I'll read to them the script, they always say, it's all right. We know where you live, with an indication that, they know that I'm not going to make a mistake. They still sign the informed consent form, but native justice and the way that they would follow up if I were to violate their trust would be much greater for me as a member of the community than someone who isn't from my community. So the accountability is real for those of us who are researchers who research in our own communities, because we live there and we raise our children in those spaces. We are descendants of ancestors who are held accountable still today for any things that we do wrong. So we enter very respectfully and very thoughtfully in the work that we do. So I think that's, the justification behind wanting researchers who are members of communities to be at the head of things is because there's a genuine promise that it will be handled in a respectful and ethical way, because there's a lot at stake.
Yeah, I also wanted to tag on to that. That was also instrumental in my PhD work. So I'm from Barbados. My supervisor was from Barbados. We had a PhD student in our lab from Nigeria, and we did the work within our communities. So the Nigerian PhD student, she reached out to her physician friends within the areas that she grew up with, and she found out what they needed from her and how she could also help them with research. My PhD supervisor from Barbados and myself, if we were to ever do anything that was not right, it would be looked down upon very, very harshly. And that's why it's so important that, as Miley was saying, that granting agencies should have some type of mechanisms where they either see that you're active part of the community, or if you're not in the community, that you have been contributing to this community in some way over a period of time. It reminds me of a few years ago when one of our granting agencies here had included a section on equity, diversity, and inclusion that you had to put into your grant. And one of my friends, a PhD student, she was like, Sean, my professor's asking me to write this statement for him, and I didn't even know this was a thing that granting agencies are asking for. And I was like, wow, this is clearly not genuine on the professor's part, because they don't know what is required of them for this. And there's no way for this granting agency to actually double check anything that this professor or this professor's student wrote for them. And I'm actually applying for a grant myself now, and I also had to fill out that section. And I'm like, honestly, anyone could write anything here. How do they actually know that people are being genuine and that they are actually fulfilling these things that they're writing in their grants? So yeah, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot over the past few days while writing this grant.
But Sean, I just want to say though, thinking about that, if someone were to ever say, can you prove you're part of a community? I have a feeling you'd be able to do that. I could prove I'm part of a community. I've got photos, I got bruises, I got all kind of proof to demonstrate that I have literally given blood, sweat, and tears. And it's all around me. And I think that's, if you are genuinely part of a community, it's easy to demonstrate it. We just have to get funding agencies to think about and take our suggestions. Those of us who are community-based researchers or researchers who are representative of communities need to help funding agencies design something so that there's some way to determine whether or not someone is genuinely has given and contributed back to a community before getting funded to work with that community.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I mean, this last point was very important, Sean. I mean, if we go back at the exercise of ticking boxes, right? How do we? And sometimes it's a tough one. We strive to fill a gap and to implement processes, and then we have to make sure that these processes are actually aiming and meaningful, and that's sometimes very difficult, of course, when you have these incidences like the professor asking the students to fill a very important statement about his research or grant application. And yes, it's very difficult sometimes for us granting agency to check upon receipt of many of these applications, but there is still something we can do, I think, in perhaps being more rigorous in the request, as we have spoken up until this point, in the request of embedding some more criteria and eligibility in the when it comes to working with communities and of any kind, and yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just remembered a recent example. This other funding mechanism that I saw recently was actually asking for a letter from a patient advocate or some type of a patient that you've worked with in the past, because this patient was clearly in the community that you were writing this grant for, and I thought that was a step in the right direction, because it's not like you are putting on paper that you've done all of this stuff and whatever. Like, you're actually getting the perspective from a patient within the community that you would like to do your research in, or that you have worked with already. So I thought that was a step in the right direction, and perhaps other granting agencies should at least start there, from hearing from the people in the community of the applicant's involvement.
Well, I wondered, thank you very much, everybody. I wondered whether you are ready for a few questions from our audience, because there's quite a few that have been bubbling up, and maybe I am. Some of them will be. I know that there is one in particular for Jeannie that I'm just going to ask right now. Jeannie, this is from Caroline. Thanks for your vulnerability, Jeannie. Apologies if I'm reading the question. Do you know the number of participants and whether there will be changes to the policy or practice based on the pharmacogenomic study, and what time frame that might be?
I wish I had something to say to that. Yeah. So the project that we were part of was like a literature review and some interviews with people who would be involved in that sort of thing, and some modeling. Not all the papers from that has been released yet. If you Google Linda and I's names together, it should pop up with the papers that have been published. It is not up to us to get this sort of thing funded. Obviously, there is really intense interest and hope about it, but it's it's not that far along. We're still doing some more arms of the project, including hopefully some Indigenous specific question gathering for Indigenous people in BC. So if anybody Indigenous in BC is interested in pharmacogenomics for major depression, please Google my name. Yeah.
So this is a question for anyone who feels they have the answers or part of the answer. It's been upvoted several times. And has anyone compiled a resource or best practices that have been or can be taken to establish trust with Indigenous or marginalized community for health research? Is there such a resource out there?
I'll take a stab at that. I'd have to say there isn't, if the question is specifically around genetics and genetic research, the Silent Genomes Project that I've mentioned a couple times, headed by Dr. Lara Arbour and Nadine Caron, on the website. So if you Google Silent Genomes, there are a couple pages that have international resources. And those of us who are part of that project, there's an International Indigenous Advisory Council, have provided papers we've written on how to respectfully work with communities, how to get benefit back, to guarantee basically participation done in a way that respects community values. There's a lot of resources there from those of us who are kind of both Indigenous and in the field of genetic science, genomic science. So I'd start there and pull up all the papers written by there's about 10 of us or so that are on that council who are kind of doing the work both with a foot in both worlds, as both a Native person as well as someone who is doing research in ethics and genetics.
Thank you. Okay. So I think that there is a question here, and it's an interesting one for anyone who would like to answer. How to avoid tokenism, as in tokenism, in research or academia when approaching funding requirements that target diversity?
I don't want to take up all the answers, but Sean, I thought your answer was good. The patient letter from a patient. I would take it one next step. I would say, I'd say interview. A lot of letters that are submitted with grants are written by either a research assistant or the PI, so given to a patient or a community member or someone to sign. In the process of tenure and peer review type of stuff, oftentimes for promotion, they'll speak to people who have worked with a researcher to find out their strengths and weaknesses. I think that would be an awesome way to actually speak with community members and have a researcher or someone who is seeking funding to supply a list of names of members of the community that they could randomly, whichever call, and get people's honest feedback on whether or not a person has contributed and what that contribution looks like.
I like that. A lot.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. So many reference letters are written by the applicants themselves. I guess a way that they try to circumvent that, and for some granting agencies, is that they would send a link to the actual to the person making the reference. But even that, that the researcher could still be there, like sending either the document to this person or standing over them, helping them type the response. So I completely agree. Some type of interview process would be a step forward from the patient letter.
And I have yes, please,
like
Linda.
To add that as a patient partner, I've now looked at involved in 2 future research projects where I've been asked to write a letter about how I see my involvement in that research and my connection to the topic of the research. and also how my connection to the main research team. So by doing that and having discussion on that letter with the people at the top of the research project, I feel that they have a clear understanding of what I am looking for as a research patient partner researcher, and I understand where they're headed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have another question, and this is a question and a statement, I think, at the same time, but a very good one. And we touched upon this a little bit before. How can we require researchers to actually be from the community themselves? So, Miley, we've been touching upon this in particular. And the question goes on and says, without having to wait for systemic change, but how can we do that to allow at the same time more underrepresented community members to access to advanced education? Because we can't have one without the other. So what do you do in your community for this to happen and encourage this to happen? Does anyone have any thoughts?
So I was a professor prior to leaving the university, and I created a global Indigenous public health program that was training and targeted Indigenous populations from all over the world to learn advanced methods in biostatistics and epidemiology and research and causal modeling, all the things that would be required for them to enter into a PhD program so that they could become the investigators that we need them to be. I think it's universities prioritizing research being led by communities means that they need professors who are doing work to teach, to create a line, a lineage of graduates who can do this work. But in the meantime, there are a lot of us out here now. It's not like it was 20 years ago where there were no people of color doing research or minority populations, both sexual orientation, disabilities. We are here and we should be funded and we should be leading this work. And if we don't have the track record in history to get the funding because we haven't done it before, then require partnerships or ask people to partner so that those who don't have that track record build it with folks who have. But a lot of the people who get funded today are people who have already been funded. And so there's, really a lot of this lies on the funding agencies to really rethink how they want research to look. And we can't do things the way that we've done it before because it hasn't reached and made a dent in the disparities that our communities face.
Yeah, my PhD supervisor would often refer to this as like the leaky pipeline. So somewhere along the line, people from minoritized groups are like somehow pushed out of the system, right? For a lot of my friends and colleagues, funding is a huge issue. Like to do a postdoc is a privilege because the funding is not there for postdocs. And for you to do a postdoc, you either, in most cases, you either have some type of family money, quote unquote, or you have some other stream of income, especially if you're living in a big city like Toronto, because it is not sustainable. So you're losing so much talent from people who can who are capable of doing this research, but due to systemic barriers, they're not able to actually reach that goal to become a professor or an independent researcher. So honestly, it really boils down to funding. There was a strike actually on Monday for this. Sadly, I was here for the conference, so I didn't get to actually strike. But it's being talked about more and more. Like, we have to bring people through the entire pipeline, from student to independent researcher. And what Miley just said, it was a very great point. If that person doesn't have the track record, they should be given the opportunity to partner with someone, and that person help bring them along the journey to secure funding and get that research done. There also, I'm seeing a few calls recently that are targeted funding mechanisms, where they're saying, okay, well, this particular group of people, so racialized women, Black people, Indigenous people, like, apply for this funding for your research, specifically postdocs and PhD students, master students, and I think these are good directions from these agencies. But obviously, there's always more that can be done.
Thank you very much, Sean. I think we've exhausted the questions, the Q&A from the audience. I do have a question myself that I want to ask all of you from your different perspective, which is one we haven't really talked a lot about, but that touched a little bit. And certainly Keolu in his presentation also touched upon. I wanted to know, as panelists, wanted to ask you really, how do you think that data sovereignty plays a role in addressing these health disparities we've been talking about from your own perspective? Who would like to start?
I'm pretty comfortable with the topic, but I wanted to, Jeannie, you had your hand up, so I wanted to just make sure you had a chance if you wanted to respond before I dove into something.
I know we kind of moved past the diversity topic, but I just wanted to say, as somebody, not necessarily a person of talent at all, who kind of got bumped out of that pipeline, but the people that are in 6 years going to be your grad students that you're trying to pick for PhDs right now, they're in high school and they're in their first year of undergrad. And for me, me not being able to continue my undergrad because of not getting accommodations for my mental illness, it happened pretty early on. So I think advocating for like high school and undergraduate diversity and support, really on a really basic like housing and access to mental health support, is a big reason why there isn't that population of grad and PhD students that are fulfilling, the things that you want. As far as data sovereignty, as a layperson, that is a lot of the concern that I came to the project with, is not knowing, theoretically where any of this genetic data would be stored. And even if it's stored in one place right now, not knowing how it's going to be stored in 10 years or 20 years, like what's the potential for it to be sold somewhere else or stored in places that obviously we're not psychic and we can't know that. But even knowing that I think a lot of people who bought 23andMe tests weren't fully educated that their data could be sold at all potentially. And it's stuff along that lines as a patient partner is what are red flags to me.
Absolutely. Fabulous points. Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you very much. Miley, you wanted to say something about data sovereignty.
Sure. I just want to, just thank Canada as a whole. You guys have done the best, I think, of really the principles that we've sort of held up as some of the best models of not only data sovereignty, but just protection of data. So DNA on loan, OCAP, fair and care, principles that the rest of the world should look at as ways to ensure that data is being handled in a respectful way, and that data is not something that is the tissue or the data is not ownership of the investigator, but of the person themselves. Canada's kind of led the way in this. So I just want to thank all of you who have been part of making these conversations very public, very part of the fabric of the way that work is done in Canada. I'm sure it's the actual or implementation of these values, these principles is harder to actually put into place. But in the United States, for me as a Native Hawaiian, we don't even have federal recognition. The United States doesn't still recognize us as Indigenous people, despite the illegal overthrow and occupation and apology for that occupation and overthrow. I live in a country where there is very little recognition for us as Native people. In Canada, you have so much more. So my hat's off to you folks, and lead the way. Tell us how to do it.
Thank you, Maile. Actually, this is something I also been noting. I've only arrived in Canada 2.5 years ago, and one of the things that working on this sort of issues, one of the things I noticed is indeed Canada is leading on many of these care and fair, and as you mentioned, these data sovereignty principles. But I do know US tends to lead on the biobanking side of things, right? So I sometimes feel, as I said in my introduction, that really it's our collective responsibility here to move this forward, and maybe working together, complementing each other's strength to fill the gaps in the future is really the way to go in this. But thank you very much for that thought. I have another question. Did somebody want to say something? Did I interrupt somebody? No. Okay. I have another question that has just arrived, and I actually quite like it. And I know that some of you may want to offer some examples close to your experience. But an anonymous question: do you have examples of case studies that demonstrate effective partnership building between researchers and underrepresented communities?
I'm just gonna jump in and say that I have to go to work, so I'm gonna be tuning out. And just that it was thank you guys so much for inviting me. And it was really amazing to talk to everybody. Thanks,
Jeannie. Thank you so much. We can't thank you enough for being here and dedicating to us this time. Your contribution was extremely valuable. Thank you. So anyone wants to add? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, like I mentioned before, I think you folks in Canada have the best examples of good partnerships. Linda and Rich and Jeannie's studies that they're partnering and on, I think would be, just hearing from you folks as patient partners, I think even though it's still in the early stages, is an example of people, partners, community partners actually speaking up on behalf of the process. So I think we should all keep our eyes up on that study and see what amazing things come out of it. I think Silent Genomes and the work to create Indigenous councils and leadership is an example out of Canada that is a great case study for how it takes time to build trust and to understand how to develop that. I think it's one of the best examples. And I think Laura Arbor and Nadine Caron have done a great job as an Indigenous scientist and a non-Indigenous, one of our allies, partnering to really lift up how to put community first in the work. So I think that's a great case study. I don't have any from the United States. Sorry.
Well, Thank you very much, Miley. Thank you. I think this is a wonderful note to end our panel. I think I am absolutely honored to have had the pleasure to be with you. You are extraordinary panelists with extraordinary experiences. The two of you, Linda and Miley, are extraordinary women, super women on this panel. And really, thank you very much for all your contribution, Sean, Linda, Miley, Keolu, and Ginny. I'm really, really thankful that you took the time to be with us today. So with that, I would like to just remind our audience that they will be back here for the second session of our Genomic Forum at 11:05. And please go back to your event hub and click on the next session at the right time. Thank you very much. See you soon.